Great, thank you, Sanjeev, and thank you, Fred, for inviting me. This is my first web-based seminar, so we'll see how it goes, but I'm definitely glad to have the opportunity. I should say at the outset, this is not anything that has to do with large-scale experiments of the type that you guys have been studying. I think this is something that could lend itself to going in that direction, but it is a big experiment, and there are a lot of people, and it's something that could scale up. So it'd be interesting to talk afterwards about whether there's opportunities for that. This is joint work with Björn Bartling and Vanessa Valero and Lan Yao. We have a few projects related to this topic with this set of co-authors. Oops, there's my thing. Okay, so over the last decade or so, there's been a lot of interest in what we can broadly think of as moral or socially responsible behavior in markets. There's several academic articles, there's several things that have been written for a more popular audience. And I think this reflects the fact that, of course, we're interested in how we can do good and how we can get things that are good, but also with the recognition that a lot of what happens operates through markets. So things that, like pollution, things like things are done to animals, things are done to the environment, things are done to workers, in a process that ultimately also involves us making choices about what products to buy, where to work, or the types of decisions that we're interested in as economists when we think about market behavior. So there's a lot of things that are impacted by our market activity, and there's also a recognition that there's, for a variety of reasons, the things that we usually assume can help fix these problems, like taxes and regulation, may be imperfect, either because of complexity or because of regulatory capture or other reasons why we just don't seem to be able to solve problems like climate change and pollution through standard policy tools. So one consequence of this is that there's a tension and interest in the notion that by being responsible consumers, workers, sellers, we can somehow help alleviate these problems, right? And this concept of social responsibility has been around for a while, but it's something that gets attention every time there are issues that are pointed to as some consequence of market behavior, right? Even today, there's great debate about the role that firms and people's consumption choices should play in issues related to race and discrimination that are linked to the types of things I'm going to talk about. So this is just kind of to set the stage for the type of thing that we're interested in. In order to understand it better, though, what we want to have is a way of kind of bringing it into the type of context where we can study these types of choices, behaviors, and the outcomes that they produce in a way that's helpful, right? So we see a lot of real-world instances where there's calls for social responsibility, where people say that they're acting out of concerns for social responsibility, but we don't really know if that's the case, right? There's a lot of reasons why real-world behavior is quite messy and complicated. And so one thing we did with some of the co-authors on this paper a few years ago is develop this laboratory paradigm for trying to mimic kind of a consumer market where products vary in the social impact that they have, and where we can see whether or not there's a stable, sizable concern among market participants for socially responsible products, and whether this is something that persists with market experience and with varying market characteristics, or whether it's something that gets driven out in a market context. And so what we did is we created this simple laboratory paradigm that we studied in a computerized laboratory, where firms interact with consumers and potentially impose negative externalities on passive third parties that don't do anything in the experiment other than sit there and possibly lose money. So firms in this experiment decide on what type of product to produce. And in this case, it's binary. They can produce a product that doesn't harm people or one that harms people. And then they decide a price in a post-offer market. And then consumers decide what type of product to buy. In the baseline case, they observe the types of products that are available and the prices. And the products that are harmful create this significant monetary harm for a third party, who again is like a recipient in a dictator game experiment, who's just sitting there not doing anything other than potentially losing money based on other people's choices. In a variant of this, we have different types of externalities that don't seem to impact the behavior quite substantially. And I won't go into that other paper, but the reference is here if you're interested. And then, of course, another realistic feature is that products that mitigate the externality, that are more socially responsible, cost more to produce. Right? So what we wanted to see is it the case that in this type of setup, we can observe something that looks like a stable preference for socially responsible products? And this is basically what we find. Right? So across time, what I'm showing you here is the market share for the socially responsible product in our baseline condition. What we see is that it's fairly stable. In this case, it's at close to 50%, which I don't think that's particularly meaningful because that changes based on other parameters in the experiment. But the key thing is that this preference for this socially responsible product is something that persists in a market environment. People repeatedly are willing to pay more to produce and consume something that doesn't harm other participants. And I'll go through the details of this particular design more carefully because it forms a starting point for the experiment I'll talk about today. And one nice feature of a lab experiment is that it lets us vary a lot of things, so we can see what happens as we change one factor at a time. And that's what we did in this paper, where from the baseline, we varied a lot of things, like introducing more competition among firms, by making it so that consumers have to actually acquire information about the types of products that are out there and possibly even pay to acquire information. And what you see here is that behavior moves around a little bit in terms of the market share of the socially responsible product, but it still remains fairly stable and at substantial rates. In fact, the only thing that seems to change it really substantially is doubling the cost of producing the product that mitigates the externality. And so that makes sense. If there's a preference, people act on it. If it becomes more costly to act on that preference, you see less of that behavior. And so what we observe here is that's one thing that substantially changes the prevalence of the socially responsible product in the market. So what we take from this is there seems to be a fairly robust and sensible preference that people are acting on in their market behavior. The one other thing we did in this first paper was we ran experiments in both Switzerland and China. And we also ran a variant of the experiment that takes the same set of choices, but gives them to people in a non-market context. And so what we found here was that both in Switzerland and China, non-market prosociality is higher than market prosociality, right? So the dashed lines represent what happens in this non-market context, where the choices really are as identical as possible between the two. But when you put people in a market context, they become less prosocial, and in the market context are less prosocial in China than in Switzerland, right? And so this gap is something that we'll use in the experiment that I'll talk about today. But the key thing to take from this is that in this first experiment, we find that in the market, at least, there seems to be a lower manifestation of social responsibility in the experiments we ran in Shanghai than the ones we ran in Switzerland. Right? We don't want to generalize to entire populations or say anything broader, other than the fact that there seem to be some populations that exhibit higher concern for social impact in a market context than others, even though the level of prosociality outside of the market seems to be quite similar between the two. So that's basically just a really quick summary of our first experiment. And what this helps us do is something that I'm interested in more broadly, which is trying to understand what factors influence participants' concern for social impact, right? So in another project that I won't talk about today, we look at workers who decide whether to work for firms that have positive or negative social impact. Of course, there's a lot of research on this related types of questions. That's another example of where you act through a market and potentially produce good or bad things, and where the choices potentially matter. But what we're interested here is looking at what types of things may influence the degree to which people exhibit concern for social impact. And what we study here is something that we can think of broadly as public discourse. Right? So public discourse is a term capturing a lot of things like discussions about what's the right thing to do, campaigns intended to get people to change their behavior in terms of the right products to buy or the right things to do when they interact through markets. And these are things that are widespread, right? There's many examples of them. So the World Economic Forum regularly hosts discussions and produces publications based on responsible consumption, responsible behavior on the part of businesses, in this case addressing pollution and the use of non-reusable plastics. And so these are the types of things that we regularly see if we go out and look for them or spend time on the internet or watching the news. If our kids come home from school, that regularly kind of bring home information that they learned about kind of what's good or bad. So these are just discussions that are taking place, right? They occur at the level of the World Economic Forum. They also occur more organically with people kind of tweeting things and, kind of using social media to create pressure on market actors to change their behavior. So we see this regularly, right? This actually I got yesterday by just kind of tweeting, doing a search on Twitter for plastics. Turns out you don't have to look that far before you see some examples of where these types of public campaigns at least are claimed to have effects or seem to be potentially changing behavior. Greenpeace has been around for a long time, and large part of what they do is encourage these types of discussions. Here's an example yesterday taken from Greenpeace as well. PETA, the discussions about whether fur is something we should not consume, urging consumers to forego using fur, urging companies to stop using fur products. Right? These are the types of widespread public campaigns and that to a large extent seem aimed at generating discourse and discussions about the right thing to do. So we know these types of things exist out there, but how much do they actually work, right? I think that's an open question of which we don't have a great deal of data on whether or not these things have actually been effective at producing change. You can find anecdotal examples, you can find instances, but from a broader perspective, we need to understand better about kind of whether they work and the conditions under which they work. And so that's ultimately what this paper is about. And one reason why we can imagine why they might not be effective is discourse can have multiple perspectives and multiple sides, right? So for example, when it comes to the use of fur, right, one side like PETA can argue that we shouldn't use fur, that fur is harmful. But there is this Fur Council of Canada that argues that fur is actually kind of an ecological, renewable, very green product that has been used for thousands of generations. And what's more green than fur? And so you can come up with counter arguments, right? Counter narratives about why something may actually be the responsible thing to use. That may mean that you ultimately don't change that much behavior, or that people discount whatever arguments are brought up. And so what we do in this paper is study this particular type of question. It's of course related to a large amount of research on communication in experiments in strategic settings. And a lot of this research shows that communication can solve problems potentially related to externalities or self-interest and move people towards more efficient outcomes. Right? So whether in public good games, in situations involving incomplete contracting and trust, it seems that having people discuss things and engage in discourse or communication prior to interacting can help. But there is one important difference between the types of contexts we're studying and these contexts. In these settings, like public goods games or trust games, if we don't communicate, we end up at an inefficient outcome. And what seems to happen is communication helps us produce a Pareto improvement, right? It helps us produce something better than the outcome where we don't communicate. In our case, what we're looking at, though, is a situation where communication ultimately, in order to be effective, has to convince some people, like consumers and firms, to do things that harm themselves. Right? So in a sense, it has to get people to agree to do something that's going to be financially costly and going to leave them with less money in the experiment than otherwise. And if we think about these public discourse campaigns, ultimately that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get people to change their behavior, to buy something that's more expensive, or to use a means of transportation that's perhaps less convenient. And so this previous research doesn't really tell us much about what's going to happen in those particular types of situations. So what we do in our experiment is in our paper is we have two experiments where we do something rather simple in the sense that we introduce this public discourse as a form of communication, where we allow people, typically at the beginning of the experiment, after they find out what the experiment's about, to engage in communication and discussion via an electronic chat about what they should do in this market context, right? And so we basically let them spend a fair amount of time just saying whatever they want about the upcoming interaction. What the reason for looking at this in a lab experiment is, of course, it lets us do things like vary the social responsibility or social impact of a product while not varying anything else, which is not true when you're looking at real world products which vary on many dimensions. And so in this case, we can make a cleaner comparison. Of course, we can also very cleanly vary the presence or absence of discourse and the nature of discourse and the way in which people can interact and who can interact. And then the other thing we can do is we can take exactly the same market exactly the same setup and implemented in different populations, right? Much like we did in the first paper with Switzerland and China, where we took exactly the same market interaction and saw different outcomes, we can see whether institutions have the same or different effect in different populations in this case. The other thing we're going to do, I'm going to focus on talking about behavior, but the other thing we do is at the end, we also measure norms about socially responsible market behavior using this incentivized solicitation technique for measuring social norms that Aaron Krupke and I developed, which involves using coordination games to get at perceptions of social appropriateness or what people agree is the right thing to do in a particular setting. Okay, so let me get into the design. So the design is, I'll first go through the baseline, which is the same as the baseline from the Bartling, Weber, and Yao paper. So in our market, there are 6 firms, 5 consumers, and 5 third parties. Everyone starts off with 100 units of wealth, which in the Switzerland experiments is 25 francs. If an exchange occurs between a firm and a consumer, it increases the consumer's wealth by 50 units. Each firm is going to offer at the beginning of a period a single unit of a product. They're going to set a price P, which is between 0 and 50, and they're going to select a type of product. In this case, it's binary. In other versions of the experiment, it's a continuous product, but in this case, it's binary. And so there's a product that produces an externality and costs one of the third parties, who again have no role in the experiment other than possibly incurring these externalities, 60, right? So 60% of their wealth. Or they can produce a product that has no external cost, but that involves an additional production cost for the firm of 10. This is the interface that firms see. So they choose what type of product to offer. They enter a price for their product. And then consumers arrive and see the products available and select from among them. And so this is basically what a consumer sees in this market. They see the products available. In the baseline case of that first paper that we did, they see what the types of the products are that are available. They can select one, accept that product, or they can reject everything. And if a consumer rejects everything, then that consumer doesn't impose an externality on the third party, right? So choosing not to buy any product also means there's no externality. So then these are the final payoffs, right? So as a firm, if you don't sell anything, or as a consumer, if you don't buy anything, you simply have your 100. If you sell something as a firm, you get the price. And if you chose the responsible type of product or the fair type of product, you have to pay an additional 10 of production costs. If you're a consumer, you simply get this if you buy a product, right? The value to you of a product is 50, and you pay whatever the price is that you had to pay to acquire that product. And then as a third party, you get 100. And if the consumer that you're linked to in that period buys a product of the wrong type, the externality producing product, you lose 60, otherwise you lose nothing. So this is the basic setup, right? It's a simple market experiment with a posted offer market. As I said earlier, we've done lots of different versions of the externality technology, of the firms, of the market structure. And in general, the results don't seem to change. They seem to be robust to a lot of characteristics. Okay. So if anything's unclear, please ask questions as well, because I want to make sure that I'm not going too quickly. So what we do, so that basically is the baseline design from the Bartling, Weber, Yao paper. What we do here is we simply introduce an 8-minute discussion period, typically after the market instructions. In our baseline, basically they get the market or in most of our treatments, it'll be after they receive, or in all of our treatments, it'll be after they receive instructions about the market, but the actual timing of the discourse will change between treatments. So in our baseline, it'll be just as I described. There's no discourse. They receive the instructions, they learn their roles, and they go right into the market. So this is basically a direct replication of what we had in the earlier paper. And then our remaining treatments all introduce a form of discourse. So the first one of these is something we call the veil treatment. And so what we do here is we try to create an idealized form of discourse where if there's any setting in which arguments about doing the responsible thing are going to kind of be potentially influential or are going to arise, it's going to be when people don't know their role in society and know that they may end up being one of these third parties that may be harmed by the negative externality. So in this treatment, they communicate after hearing the market instructions about the market, but before knowing their role, right? Before knowing whether they're a buyer, seller, or a third party in the experiment. And so we think this is an idealized type of communication that, of course, is unlikely to occur in the real world, where we typically know our positions or know something about where we're likely to end up. And so we want to contrast this with a more natural setting where what we do is we remove the veil. And so the key distinction between these two treatments is that in the no veil, we simply move the communication to after people are informed of their roles. So they receive the market instructions, they learn about their role, and then they can engage in this type of discussion. The next treatment moves one step further into something that we think typically happens when this discourse takes place. So for example, discussions at the World Economic Forum or discussions taking place on social media often involve discussions between people in high-income countries who are the ones producing products, making consumption decisions that impact other people elsewhere in the world, that may be excluded from forums where these discussions take place, that may not have access to the media or technologies that allow them to express the impacts that they experience. And so in this exclusive treatment, what we do is we exclude third parties, right? And so now only buyers and sellers can participate in this discussion. The third parties have a separate communication forum where they can basically talk among themselves, but nobody else sees that other than themselves. And then after this, they participate in all conditions in the market for 24 periods. And then at the end, we elicit these social norms regarding how appropriate it is to exchange a harmful product in this type of market setting. So one other thing we do is we run the experiment both in Zurich, using students primarily from the University of Zurich and the Federal Institute of Technology, the ETH, and then we also run it in Shanghai at the Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, which is where we ran those earlier market experiments and found differences in terms of the degree of a concern for social impact between Switzerland and Shanghai. So now I've described what the experiment is. Let me briefly then kind of take you through the hypotheses that we had going into this and the reasons why we chose these particular treatment combinations. Excuse me. So just as a way of kind of representing what we're thinking about, right? Think about basically the utility function for someone in our experiment is comprising a concern for your own personal monetary payoffs, which is your payoff on the experiment, and also potentially a concern for the social impact that you produce in the form of an externality that may affect someone else. In the Bartling-Weber-Yao paper, we use a simple utility function like this and estimate the parameters, including theta, and find that that actually represents behavior across treatments quite well, even holding the values of theta relatively constant. And so this simple type of utility function may capture behavior in this type of setting quite well. The thing we're interested in is this degree of social concern theta, which here we make dependent on two things. Right? So gamma is going to correspond to some baseline level of social concern. This could be kind of some intrinsic level in the population, some existing level of social norms of market conduct that may differ between populations, right? And so as I've already shown you, we have some reasons to believe it may differ between the Swiss sample that we study and the sample in China that we study. And then D is simply going to correspond to the type of discourse in which we're able to engage. So this is our discourse treatments, right? So the baseline has no discourse, and then these other versions of D are going to be simply different forms of discourse in which we may engage. And so let's start then with the first treatment that I discussed, which is this idealized communication behind the veil of ignorance, right? In terms of the work on narratives by Benabou, Falk, and Tirole, here we might expect something like what they call responsibilizing narratives, right? Narratives that basically say, look, the right thing to do, given that any of us could be the third party, is to trade only the responsible product. These narratives might be particularly powerful given that everyone knows that they could end up in that role. Appeals to efficiency might be particularly convincing here as well, given that in expectation any of us could be a third party and could be harmed by this substantial negative externality. And so we expect that in this particular type of setting, these appeals or what will arise in the discourse will really be the best shot that communication has to change behavior. And so our first hypothesis is that relative to the absence of discourse, the introduction of discourse behind the veil of ignorance will produce greater social concern, which will manifest itself in a higher level of socially responsible products, right? Higher market share. Then the next set of hypotheses we have is what happens as we introduce additional realistic features, right? So what happens as we go from veil and remove the veil? So now people know their roles in society before entering into discourse. And so what we expect here is that basically now, once you know that you're a consumer or a buyer or a seller and not a third party, right, arguments for why, you know, it's not your responsibility to trade the fair product, why, you know, people aren't really harmed that badly. These may be these types of excusing arguments or exculpatory arguments may become more compelling. We may be more likely to see them, and so we expect that once you remove the veil, right, the concern shown by consumers and firms in our experiment will be lower. Right? This will manifest itself in a lower level of social concern. Then the next thing is what happens when we, in addition to removing the veil, also kick out the third parties from these discussions. And here there's some evidence from dictator experiments. A paper by Andreoni and Rao finds that when recipients in a dictator game can't send messages, or rather when they can send messages, it increases empathy and concern on the part of dictators. So giving people the opportunity to voice the impacts that one's choices has on them seems to have some effect, at least in dictator game experiments. And so what we expect here is that kicking the third parties out of the discussion will mean that there's less arguments in favor of taking them into account. Their concerns will be less salient. And so we'll expect that there will be even less concern for social impact in this particular treatment. Now, one thing that we don't form hypotheses about is where the no veil and exclusive treatments end up relative to the baseline, right? So basically our hypotheses were that adding the veil, the communication behind the veil of ignorance to the baseline will increase concern for social impact, and then removing the veil and removing the third parties from discourse will lower it. But whether or not it lowers it back to the level of the baseline, remains above it or below it, is an open question that we didn't have any strong reasons to believe would be one way or another a priori. Right? You can imagine that the arguments that arise are still sufficiently compelling to lead people to exhibit more concern for social impact than when no debate takes place. Or you could imagine, especially in exclusive treatment, that the rationalizations and justifications for why it's not so bad to impose this harm actually lead to something lower than in the baseline. And then we have one final reason for another variation in our experiment, which is this comparison to Switzerland and China, where we don't form a hypothesis, but rather we have a research question based on the potential interaction between discourse and the baseline levels of pre-existing social concern. So if you remember from earlier, what I showed you is that the degree of apparent concern for social impact in the market, right? The market share of the socially responsible product was higher in Switzerland than in China. And so we want to see whether introducing discourse and introducing an opportunity to discuss and talk about what's the right thing to do in the market interacts with this, right? And basically whether the change in Switzerland, when you go from no discourse to discourse, how that compares to the change in China. Right? And so here we could imagine that it's independent and you see kind of a similarly large effect in both populations. You could imagine that they're somehow complements and you need to have this existing concern for for kind of social responsibility in order for the arguments that encourage other people to act in this manner to arise. Or you could imagine that they're substitutes, that the people who can be convinced are already convinced in environments with high degrees of concern for social impact, and the only thing discourse can do is lead other people to kind of catch up and express those concerns. So we don't have a hypothesis about this, but we basically kind of introduced this treatment as a way of seeing whether there was any interaction of this type. Okay, so before I go on, let me see if there are any questions in terms of the design or the procedures, because I think that those are good to clarify at this point. So then let me go on to the results then. So I can go through these fairly quickly. So this is the baseline. So this is a replication of what we did in the first paper, and basically the levels are quite similar. So in Switzerland, we have an average market share of the fair product of 49. In Shanghai, it's a bit lower than what it was in our first paper. In this case, it's 15. Now, what we're interested in is the first hypothesis deals with what happens when we introduce this communication behind the veil of ignorance, right? So people don't know yet what role they're going to have. And our hypothesis there was that it would increase the concern for social impact. And this is actually what we find both in Switzerland and in China, right? And in Switzerland, it's really quite striking that the market share of the fair product, based on this one-time discussion at the very beginning of the experiment, right, they don't discuss before every period, goes up to essentially very close to 100%. Right? The fair product is almost the only one traded in all of these markets. In China, it goes up quite substantially as well, but not quite as high. But then again, they're starting from a lower baseline. So in terms of then, this is a fairly conservative test of statistical significance. We also report regressions, but what this is showing you is just using the market, where there are 8 in each condition, as a unit of observation, rank sum tests, right? And we see that in both Switzerland and China, the change in the market shares is quite substantial, not just in magnitude, but also in statistically significant, even using this fairly conservative test. Okay, so that's basically then confirmation that when you have this discussion prior to engaging in market interaction, behind the veil of ignorance, it produces this quite substantial improvement in terms of concern for social impact. So our next hypothesis dealt with what happens when we remove the veil, right? And there, what we predicted is that concern for social impact should decline. And so let's see if it does. This is the graph I showed you before. And so what we can see now is what happens when we remove the veil. It does decline, right? It goes down, but not by a great deal, right? So it goes down by roughly 9 or 10% percentage points in each of the two settings. So we do see this decline, but it doesn't take us anywhere near back to the baseline levels. And we see that in Switzerland, the decline is statistically significant using this conservative market level test. In China, the decline is not statistically significant, right? Part of the reason why it's significant in Switzerland is because the veil condition has so little variation. Almost all the markets are very close to 100%. So anything below that is getting us something that's statistically different. So we see there is that in Switzerland, there is this decline. It is statistically significant. It's not large in magnitude, but maybe we don't want to make too much of any differences in terms of a magnitude. In China, the change is roughly comparable in magnitude, but not statistically significant. The next question then is, when we go from no veil to a treatment in which we kick out the third parties, what happens? And so here, remember, our hypothesis was that when we kick out the third parties, now there'll be kind of even fewer arguments in support of their viewpoint. There'll be less empathy for their concerns. And so what we see here is then, starting from the green bars, what happens? We see that in Switzerland, it actually goes back up. Right? Slightly, it's not significantly different. In China, it goes down a bit further. It's still higher than it was in the baseline, but that neither of these changes is statistically significant at conventional levels in these rank sum tests. And so what we see here is that basically we don't see any kind of substantial, in terms of statistically significant, or even huge in terms of magnitude change in behavior when you kick out the third parties. And so we kind of find that in some cases discourse has the types of effects that we expect. In other cases, it's kind of surprising and maybe perhaps also reassuring from the point of view of it looks like this actually works better than we expected in terms of increasing concern for social impact and the market share of these fair products in this market setting. So another thing that I mentioned earlier that we didn't form hypotheses about was, what happens in terms of the no veil and exclusive relative to the baseline, right? And what we already saw is that, in all of these conditions, it seems to end up that even after you kick out the third parties, even after you remove the veil of ignorance, the concern for social impact remains higher than it was in the baseline when there was no discourse. So even though there's some indication, especially in China, that that once you start introducing these features, the concern for social impact declines, it still seems to remain higher than the baseline where there's no discourse. And you can see this here where, again, we're making these comparisons in the blue for China and the black for Switzerland to the baseline, and we see that they're significantly different using this conservative test in all of them relative to the baseline. We can also see this in regressions where we look at both for Switzerland and for China. The treatment effects are positive relative to the mid category, which is the baseline. And so the discourse seems to have a positive effect relative to the treatment in which discourse is absent in all of these conditions. And again, going back to something I said earlier, this is consistent with work that we've seen from prior experiments on communication. But what's really striking in this case is this is not like a public goods game where everyone's agreeing to do something that benefits them and sticking to it. This is an environment in which, like in the exclusive case, buyers and sellers, without even third parties being present, are agreeing to do something that's personally harmful. They're going to lose money by kind of reaching this agreement and sticking to it, and yet it still seems to have this positive effect. In terms of the comparison of the effect of discourse between Switzerland and China, eyeballing this, you can see that in both cases there's increases. The increases don't look to be that substantially different. And in fact, when we run regressions where we have interactions between China and the treatments, none of them are statistically significant. And so, we take that as a sign that, that there doesn't seem to be any of this interaction between the baseline levels of social concern and the discourse treatments, which, might have been more interesting if there was, but that's what the data ultimately shows. So I have, I think, about 5 minutes, so let me just summarize this and then talk about the second experiment, which I can get through quickly. So, the main finding, and to some extent also somewhat surprising to us, is that just introducing this 8 minutes of discussion has a very strong positive effect on social responsibility, both in Switzerland and China, and really in all conditions, even the ones that were kind of designed to make it harder for it to work, like the ones where you kick out the third parties. The effects seem to be similar between Switzerland and China. I also won't talk about it here, but another thing we did was we recognize that when we do communication experiments, we often change two things. We give people the opportunity to communicate. We also force them to sit some amount of time thinking about the topic. And so here it's potentially important, partly because campaigns also often involve doing things like telling people, think about your behavior, right? So they often involve like ads that say, think about the impact that your choices have on animals or on the environment. And so what we do is we ran afterwards another condition that we call private, where people have the same amount of time and they just basically sit there and write a message that's not going to be seen by anyone. So there's no discourse, but it's still this prompting and priming. So what we see there is that the private condition increases social responsibility. It doesn't account for the entire effect of discourse in Switzerland, but in China it does seem to account for a large part of the discourse effect. So I can show you that later if you want during the discussion, but let me move on. And then lastly, this measure of social norms regarding how appropriate it is to trade product that produces harm. What we see is that this is a rating of the appropriateness where -1 means it's very inappropriate, 1 means it's entirely appropriate. And what we see is that the behavior is also reflected in changes in these perceived social norms using this incentivized technique, which I can tell you more about later during questions if you want. And it largely corresponds to the treatment effects that we observe, right? So it isn't just on behavior, it's also on the norms that people seem to kind of end up with at the end of this experiment. Okay, so then that's summarize experiment 1. In the last minutes I have left before question time, let me just briefly tell you about the second experiment we did. So part of where we ended up at the end of the first experiment was surprised about how positive these effects were. And so then what we started thinking about is, well, we started from something that we thought would work because it was very, idealistic, communication behind the veil of ignorance, when nobody has a stake. And then we thought we would introduce features that would diminish that positive effect. So what we do in the second experiment is, we start from this observation that, it's kind of surprising, especially in Switzerland, how big an effect this has. And of course, it's still somewhat unrealistic. And so what we try to do is introduce a couple of features to make it somewhat more realistic. And what we did is we implemented 2 changes. The first is, and this experiment we only conducted in Switzerland, what we do is we add 2 features. The first is we change who's being impacted by the market activity. So in the first experiment, it was a laboratory subject. It was someone sitting right there, very proximate, who was identical to you in the sense of you all showed up at the experiment, were randomly assigned to roles. equality is potentially quite salient because you all start off with this 100 that's easy to compare across people. So what we did is we made the impact be a bit more realistic by making the impact on the size of donations to this charity, which is COTAP, which is Carbon Offsets to Alleviate Poverty. Basically, it's a charity that pays farmers to plant trees in low-income countries. This is more realistic in the sense of the types of impacts that we usually talk about when we talk about being socially responsible consumers. It's also more realistic in the sense that there are probably more accessible arguments on both sides. It's more easy for someone to say, hey, look, I don't think planting trees actually does much help, or I don't think these charities actually kind of produce much good overall, and they're highly wasteful. And so this is a bit more of a realistic type of impact that, that people might talk about, and where maybe arguments against being socially responsible are easier to come up with. And so what we did here is basically what we can think of as a baseline treatment where there's no discourse, and then an exclusive condition where essentially people know their roles and the third party can't participate. Right? We don't have the third party involved here. The charity doesn't have any say in the discourse. And then the other condition we ran gets to Sanjeev's point earlier, in that in most realistic settings, we don't get to have these discussions before the market exists. Right? Maybe with respect to kind of AI and social responsibility, we're having these discussions before any real kind of big markets exist. But in things like climate change, usually we have these discussions after we've been consuming and producing and engaging in market activity for a while. And so what we did here is we basically introduced an experience condition where we introduced discourse following 8 periods of market activity. So they just basically play 8 rounds of the baseline, and then we stop them and say, okay, now we're going to give you this opportunity to discuss your behavior to see if it maybe is less effective in a setting where there's this existing behavior that needs to be rationalized, where we've already been doing things a certain way for a given number of rounds. And so what we do is basically is we run these 3 conditions. And the results, again, were somewhat surprising to us in that both discourse conditions, again, produce substantial increases in the market share of the responsible product. So what I'm showing you here is the market shares from part 2, which is the part in which all the treatments have been implemented. So the final 16 periods of the experiment. And what you see is that basically the baseline, it remains around 50% where it started. But in part 2 of the experiment, what you see is that both the charity, this exclusive where they engage in discourse at the beginning of the experiment, and the one where they engage in discourse after 8 rounds of market experience are both substantially higher. And these differences are statistically significant, as is the difference in the experience in the pre-part 1 stage and the post-part 2 stage, before and after they have this chance to engage in discourse. And then we again observe this impact on social norms. So when we measure the social norms at the end of the experiment, again, ranging from very appropriate to change the harmful product to very inappropriate, we see that this discourse and this experience has this effect on making exchanging the harmful product be perceived as more socially inappropriate when discourse has occurred relative to when it hasn't. Okay, so I realize I went over a couple of minutes, basically this just summarizes largely what we've said. We also look at the message content. It's noisy. We have independent raters code everything for the types of messages sent. In the Switzerland version of experiment 1, the messages don't predict anything, but that's partly because there's no variation. Remember, like almost every treatment is at close to 100% or 90% in terms of the market share of the fair products. In China, in experiment 1 and experiment 2, there seems to be some indication that other people, that messages you say and things that other people in your session say are correlated with what you ultimately do as a consumer in terms of the types of products that you buy. But again, it's noisy and not always statistically significant, but at least all the coefficients seem to be in the right direction. And again, one thing I just want to stress about our experiment is, even though it is another experiment on communication, of which there are many, I think it's interesting that we find this evidence that people are willing to use communication and that it changes their behavior, even when what they're ultimately doing is agreeing to something that harms themselves. And if we think about what these discussions and debates about when you talk to your friends about whether you should be using paper or metal straws instead of plastic straws, or when you should or shouldn't be buying these products, you're essentially kind of making arguments about why you as residents of high-income countries should be kind of doing things that cost you more money out of some sense of social responsibility or concern for social impact. And it's reassuring that at least in our experiment, it seems to be the case that actually works. But of course, the real world is much more complicated. There's a lot more that needs to be done before we can really understand, what types of effects these things have, and when they have effects. Okay, so thanks, and be glad to answer any questions.